Hi everyone. Thank you for allowing me to share a few thoughts. I wish I could be there with you in person, but hopefully these thoughts will lead to fruitful discussions. I have deeply valued the opportunity to engage with Leah's book, an opportunity for important and ongoing conversations to clarify and perhaps shift how we think about patient-centered measurement. Thank you so much, Leah, for crafting this important contribution to the field. My role today is to talk about the coordination problem, specifically from a psychometric point of view. The coordination problem serves to remind us that all measurement is inherently context-dependent and value-laden, since the process of patient-centered measurement involves the use of language. The meaning of the measure cannot be isolated from the context from which that meaning is derived. This is therefore inherently a hermeneutic problem, as well as a psychometric problem, that requires consideration of diverse and intersecting conditions, including demographic, social, cultural, psychological, and health-related conditions in the process of patient-centered measurement. And so the coordination problem reminds us that measurement is inherently value-laden and context-dependent, that measurement not necessarily requires standardization, and that measurement does not necessarily require invariance. From a psychometric point of view, this implies that measurement does not necessarily require exchangeability of items, or exchangeability of people, or exchangeability of measurement occasions, and that measurement model parameters do not necessarily need to be equivalently applicable to all people. It all depends on what inferences we want to make on the scores. What is the context in which a measurement is being applied? What are the actions and decisions that are to be made based on the scores? This, of course, all relates to the fit-for-purpose argument. One way of thinking about the purposes of patient-centered measurement is to distinguish nomothetic purposes that focus on what matters to most on average, and idiographic purposes that focus on what matters to each person. Of course, these are not binary opposites. I rather view this as a continuum, ranging from a predominant focus on wanting to describe, compare, or predict homogeneous populations or homogeneous subpopulations, towards describing and explaining heterogeneity and individual differences, and ultimately seeking to understand each person's story. I view this therefore as a dialectic or interplay between the general and the particular. This nomothetic versus idiographic distinction is of course not a new idea in the field of health-related quality of life measurement. The most obvious evidence of this lies in the many different health-related quality of life measurement instruments that have been developed over the past half-century, including generic instruments that serve a predominantly nomothetic purpose, and population-specific instruments, including disease-specific PROMs, and PROMs that are designed for other types of populations, and tailored or adaptive PROMs, where different people respond to different questions that are scaled on the same metric, and individualized PROMs, and ultimately qualitative PROMs. This range of different approaches and tools for patient-centered measurement reflects an ongoing dialectical focus on standardization, and reflects the dominant values of most people, where the items are assumed to have the same meaning for all people, and tailored or individualized measurement that reflects diverse values and where different people answer different questions for measuring what matters to them. The nomothetic versus idiographic distinction also has psychometric implications. Again, these are not new ideas, but reflect a long history and evolution of psychometric methodology, including variable-centered psychometrics that have a predominant focus on nomothetic measurement, where the emphasis is on exchangeability or dimensionality of measurement items and questions. Disaggregated or group-based psychometrics, including, for example, differential item functioning analyses. intersectionality-based psychometrics, which have also been around for some time, including mixture rash models by Rost in the 1990s, the work by von Davier on mixtures of generalized partial credit models, and our work on mixtures of item response theory models and regression tree approaches. And then there are person-specific psychometric methods that emphasize individual differences. This includes appraisal methods, cognitive interviewing, and individual-level models. All these different methods represent an interplay between a desire to establish invariance of items, people, and measurement occasions, and a desire to explain and adjust for individual differences in the estimation of patient-centered measurement scores. Here I'd like to briefly divert to the earlier work by Bruno Zombo and our subsequent applications of this, where Bruno relates the notion of exchangeability of sampling units, or people, to exchangeability of items and questions, and exchangeability of measurement occasions, to the types of inferences that can be made based on the scores. I won't go into this in detail right now, but want to briefly draw this to your attention as it relates directly to some of the ideas we are discussing here today. And so, what is the solution to all of this? Well, again, this is nothing new, but I think it is helpful to reflect specifically on what evidence is needed to warrant the inferences we want to make. Again, this relates to the fit-for-purpose argument, but it is not just fit for purpose in terms of which measurement instruments to use, but also fit for purpose in the approaches and the methods that we apply for accumulating the evidence needed to warrant the inferences we want to make. At risk of being overly simplistic, we could consider three different types of inferences. One is to assess individuals. This, of course, has to do with the use of proms in clinical practice. In this context, the notion of invariance or exchangeability is likely not so important. The important emphasis is on ensuring that the measurements reflect what matters to each person. We also use proms to compare different people. In that case, evidence of invariance is needed to ensure that the comparisons made are fair and equitable. But this does not necessarily imply that the people being compared need to answer the same questions, nor does it necessarily imply equivalence of measurement model parameters. It does, however, imply that we need to find ways of ensuring that the scores and the metrics have the same meaning for the people who are being compared. And the same idea applies to the use of proms for making comparisons over time. Clearly, we are also limited in the extent to which we can establish these evidentiary foundations. It is therefore equally important to consider the consequences or value implications of our measurements. What are the personal or societal consequences? What are the intended consequences? And are there any side effects that we need to be aware of? So overall, the notion of ongoing coordination necessitates that we cannot assume that the responses to the same questions have the same meaning for all people. We need to find ways of using different questions for different people. And we need measurement approaches that use scoring algorithms that allow for tailoring the scores to accommodate differences in how people interpret and respond to the questions. In summary, this presentation is a call for intentional methodological diversity. No method rules them all. However, the person's story or people's stories must be at the center. There's therefore a great need to integrate qualitative research and engage patients in all aspects of measurement. But this is not enough. We also need psychometric methodology to ensure we obtain the right evidence for the right purpose. A realist evaluation point of view may be helpful in determining which approaches to measurement work, for whom, and in what circumstances. Thank you for allowing me to share a few thoughts. I wish I could be there with you in person to engage in further dialogue, but hopefully these thoughts will lead to fruitful discussion. And feel free to contact me via email or to visit our website at healthyql.com for more information.